But instead of just telling you more stories about individual heroic women, I'd like to end with a group of women warriors that I really didn't expect. These were women who helped defend a besieged city. You know, I started out assuming that I was in fact going to write about women in sieges, but I was expecting to write about high-profile individual heroines and noble women who helped organize the defense of a besieged castle. And I did write about those women because you find them in many times and many places, and they deserve to be remembered. But to my surprise, it turned out that the most common type of women warriors throughout history were ordinary women who fought to defend their homes. In the 4th century BCE, a Chinese statesman named Yuan Shan called them the army of adult women, and he urged military commanders to use them to the fullest extent possible in helping defend a besieged city. And in fact, women have helped defend besieged cities for as long as there have been cities under siege. You know, over the centuries, those armies of adult women have outnumbered many times over the warrior queens and the commanders and the women who fought disguised as men and the women who fought undisguised alongside men. And yet they are the most forgotten of forgotten women warriors. You know, even when they appear in a historic account of a specific siege, their contributions are often dismissed. And that, in part, is because often the jobs they did could be seen as an extension of traditional gender roles. You know, they cared for the wounded. They carried food and drink to the people who were fighting on the wall, which is a really dangerous job. You don't want to underestimate how much courage that takes, because the other people who are on the wall have weapons to defend themselves, but the woman who's coming with the basket of bread or the bucket of beer, she's got no way to defend herself. They helped build fortifications, and at the day's end, they helped rebuild fortifications that had been damaged during the day's fighting. And those jobs were critical, but they weren't the only jobs that women did in sieges. At the Siege of Leningrad, for instance, in World War II, which is often considered one of the worst sieges in history, women dug anti-tank trenches, and they built and manned machine gun nests, and they threw Molotov cocktails under approaching tanks, which I understand doesn't really do much to stop a tank. But if that's the only thing you've got, you use what you have. And it also requires getting really close to that advancing tank. And they also patrolled their city in an effort to keep order within the city, armed with rifles, often at the end of a long day spent in the munitions factory, where they took the place of men who had already gone to the front. It's sort of Rosie the Riveter, but with the twist that at your lunch hour you get drilled with a rifle and taught how to shoot. And in the days before mechanized warfare, when wars were fought on or at the city walls, women threw things down on the besieging army. We don't think of that as warfare today, but for much of history, that was an accepted military technique. We see it as early as ancient Assyria and as late as early modern Europe. And if attackers got closer yet, some women picked up weapons and they fought alongside the city's male defenders. And they had every reason to do that. Now, early modern Europe, there's this recurring metaphor for the fall of a besieged city as a rape. Well, that metaphorical rape of a besieged city often ended with the literal rape or death of women who were its inhabitants. They had every reason to fight. One of my favorite examples of women defending a besieged city comes from the 5th century BCE, when the Greek poet Telesilla led the women of Argos in defending their city against the Spartan army. Now, at the time, Sparta was the prominent power in the region we know as Greece. They had either conquered or made alliances with most of the other city-states. And in 494 BCE, they attacked the last remaining independent city-state, which was Argos. The Spartans quickly defeated the Argive army, and the few Argive soldiers who were still standing fled and took sanctuary in a sacred grove. It turned out the Spartans didn't feel quite the same way about sanctuary that the Argives did, so they pursued them, they burned that grove to the ground, and there were no survivors. And with the Argive army destroyed, the Spartan king led his men to Argos, where he expected the inhabitants to surrender, which isn't quite what happened. Inside the city walls, Telesilla called on the women of Argos to defend their homes and their children. And under her leadership, they armed themselves with whatever weapons their men had left behind, with the ceremonial weapons from the city's temples, with the Bronze Age equivalent of cast iron skillets and carving knives. And then they followed her to the city walls, and they waited for the Spartans to attack. And when the Spartans broke through the city gates, the Argive women fought ferociously. In fact, they fought so ferociously that finally the Spartans retreated. And they never attacked Argos again. That's not quite where the story ends, though. When the battle was over, the surviving Argive women buried those who had died in defense of their city along the road that led to the city gate. And then the survivors built a monument commemorating their own actions. It's a little bit like those World War I monuments that stand in town squares all across the United States. And the fact that they built a monument commemorating their own deeds is actually my favorite part of their story. Because one of the things that holds true for women who defended cities in sieges across the centuries is we don't usually know their names. Even when we remember them, we tend to remember them as a group rather than as individuals. Now, obviously that isn't always true, because I just told you a story about Telesilla. We know her name and story. But we know them because she was already a poet of some renown in the classical world. The two women whose pictures are now on the screen also are remembered. And they're remembered because they were commemorated in their own lifetimes on broadsheets. And then those broadsheets have survived. It's a little bit like having your picture on a supermarket tabloid. The woman on your left is Gesche Mayberg. She was known during her lifetime as the Maid of Brunswick, and when her city was under attack in 1615, she stood on the fortifications and fought with a sword and a musket and urged her fellow citizens on in the city's defense. The woman on your right is Kinau Simonstochter Hesselaar. She was a middle-aged Dutch businesswoman who formed a group of women together to defend the city of Haarlem when the Spanish attacked it in the mid-17th century. You know, when I first told people I was working on a book about women warriors, almost everyone said, "You mean like Joan of Arc?" And to be honest, at first I did, at least in part. And I certainly discuss a lot of women in the book who are individual heroic figures and deserve to be remembered. But in many ways, it is these anonymous, often overlooked women who fought to defend their homes, who are the real archetype for women warriors, an early female version of citizen soldiers, as you will. In 1621, a French chronicler was writing about the siege of a city during his lifetime, and he wrote, "The women demonstrated their usual courage." Think about that for a moment. The women demonstrated their usual courage. That's an extraordinary comment, given that we tend to think of women warriors as Joan of Arc rather than G.I. Joan. And in fact, you can argue that many of the women that I write about are exceptions in their time and place, whether they were queens or revolutionaries, saints, patriots, or poets, or individual women, ordinary women, doing extraordinary things in times of crisis. As long as you focus on one historical figure, or one cluster of women, or one time period, it's easy to believe that any individual woman warrior was indeed an exception, who didn't just stand outside the norm of her own time, but outside the norm of history as a whole. After all, there's only one Joan of Arc, and the women who disguised themselves as men in order to enlist in any given war are statistically insignificant, though that's just painful to admit. And the circumstances that led women to fight at Argos or Leningrad were desperate. If you look at women warriors in isolation, it's easy to accept the way in which the accomplishments, or sometimes even the existence, of a specific woman warrior are dismissed. But when you step back and look at women warriors across the boundaries of geography and historical period, larger patterns appear. Not just in the stories of the women themselves, but how those stories are told, and more importantly, maybe, the way they're not told. But the main thing that struck me when I looked at women warriors across cultures, rather than in isolation, was how many examples there are and how lightly they sit on our collective awareness. You can say, and some people have said to me, what does it matter if a few sets of remains are misidentified or some obscure woman didn't make it into the history book? It doesn't change what we know about history in any fundamental way. Except it does. Here's the deal. If you leave women warriors out of the historical records, then it's easy to say that women do not fight and to not notice their contributions on the battlefield. If we don't show up in the history books, then it's easy to forget that women calculated rocket trajectories for NASA, or were instrumental in discovering DNA, or painted in the Renaissance, or deciphered code in World War II, or printed the first copies of the Declaration of Independence to be distributed. Looking at historical women warriors is important, not just because they give us a context for our ongoing discussion about women in the modern military, but because they're part of what journalist Rachel Swaby calls a hidden history of the world. If you put half the women, half the population back in the story, you get a very different history. Thank you.